Howard Zinn's Young People's History, Whose Independence? Every harsh act of British control made the colonists more rebellious. In 1774, they had set up the Continental Congress. It was an illegal political body, but it was also a step toward independent government. The first military clash between colonists and British troops came at Lexington and Concord in April 1775. Afterward, the Continental Congress decided on separation from Great Britain. Thomas Jefferson wrote a Declaration of Independence. The Congress adopted it on July 2nd, 1776, and announced it 2 days later. Throughout the colonies, there was already a strong feeling for independence. The opening words of the Declaration gave shape to that feeling. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and institute a new government. Next, the Declaration listed the unjust or harmful acts of the British king. It described his rule as tyranny or oppression, that is, rule by force, without fairness. The Declaration called for the people to control their government. It reminded them of the burdens and difficulties Britain had caused them. This language was well suited to bring various groups of colonists together. It could even make those who were at odds with each other turn against Britain. But the Declaration did not include Indians, enslaved blacks, or women. As for the Indians, just 20 years earlier, the government of Massachusetts had called them rebels, enemies, and traitors, and offered cash for each Indian scalp. Black slaves were a problem for the author of the Declaration. At first, Jefferson's declaration blamed the king for sending slaves to America, and also for not letting the colonies limit the slave trade. Maybe this statement grew out of moral feelings against slavery. Maybe it came from the fear of slave revolts. But the Continental Congress removed it from the Declaration of Independence because slaveholders in the colonies disagreed among themselves about whether or not to end slavery. So Jefferson's gesture toward the enslaved black was left out of the Revolution's statement of freedom. All men are created equal, claimed the Declaration. Jefferson probably didn't use the word men on purpose to leave out women. He just didn't think of including them. Women were invisible in politics. They had no political rights and no claim to equality. By its own language, the Declaration of Independence limited life, liberty, and happiness to white males. But the markers and signers of the Declaration were like other people of their time. Their ideas grew out of the ordinary thinking of their age. We don't study the Declaration of Independence so that we can point out its moral failures. We study it so we can see how the Declaration drew certain groups of Americans into action while it ignored others. In our time, inspiring words are still used to get large numbers of people to support a cause, even while the same language covers up serious conflicts among people or leaves out whole parts of the human race. The reality behind the Declaration of Independence was that it was a rising that was that a rising class of important people in the colonies needed enough support to defeat England. At the same time, they didn't want to disturb too much of the settled order of wealth and power. In fact, the makers of independence were part of the settled order. More than two-thirds of the men who signed the Declaration had served as colonial officers under the British. When the fiery Declaration of Independence was read from Boston's town hall, the reader was Thomas Crafts. He was one of the local 9, who had opposed militant action against the British. 4 days later, Boston's Committee of Correspondence ordered the town's men to show up to be drafted into a new Patriot Army, but the rich, it turned out, could avoid the draft. They could pay someone else to serve in the army for them. The poor had no choice but to serve. This led to rioting and shouting. Tyranny is tyranny. Let it come from who it may.